Levine, and happy to have all of you joining us today for this exciting event. We normally hold quarterly calls for our Birth Parent National Network that is hosted by the Children's Trust Fund Alliance. So welcome to all of you. We are going to be covering prioritizing kinship caregivers, caregiver placements, current policies, practices, and challenges. So we're looking forward to an exciting presentation today. And in the meantime, while you are here and joining, please be sure to share your name, state, and your role in the chat box. That would be great. Hello, everyone. If you have not heard, I am Meryl Levine with the Children's Trust Fund Alliance. We are happy to have you here today. Please take the time to share your name, state, and role in the chat box. Again, I'm going to kind of repeat myself a little bit until we get everybody in. We've got quite a large crowd that is joining us today, and it's an exciting topic: prioritizing kinship caregiver placements, current policies, practices, and challenges. We also are hoping that when you join us today, if you are not a member of the Birth Parent National Network and are interested in joining, we would love to have you join. The BPNN actually started in 2013, and we continue to grow in size. We have birth parents who are members from all across the country who are interested in utilizing their voices to inform policymakers and key stakeholders about issues and challenges and strengths and needs of families all across the country. The members of our BPNN really are there because of their commitment in promoting birth parents as leaders and strategic partners in prevention and child welfare system reform. If you know of parents who are interested in joining, please, they can email me directly, or we do have on our Children's Trust Fund Alliance website a place where they can actually fill out the application to join. We are not limited to just joining with birth parents. We love to have organizations that are committed to supporting birth parents also join this important network. And we also have created a new category of stakeholders where if you may not fit into the a birth parent category or an organizational category that supports birth parents in the work that they're doing, we love to have other stakeholders that are committed to really wanting to promote parents as strategic partners and using their voice to inform policy and practice. So we welcome all of you here today. If you haven't yet, put your name, state, and role in the chat box. And I am going to move us forward at this point and share with you a little bit more. What we have is we have a really exciting program with a number of presenters today, and they include Heidi Redlick Epstein from the American Bar Association Center on Children in the Law. We have Anna Beltram from the Generations United and the Generations United National Technical Assistance Center. We have Allison Caliendo, who is from the Foster Kinship Program out of Nevada, and Christina Romero, our own Birth Parent National Network member, who's joining us, and she's going to open us up for our program today. So I am going to turn it over to you, Christina, and then when you're finished, you will be turning it over to our other presenters to introduce themselves. So I will turn it to you, Christina.
All right, thank you, Meryl, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Christina Romero, and I am a parent leader in Broward County, Florida. I was happy to participate in this webinar because I do have the experience as a kinship caregiver, and also my family provided kinship care for my child. When I was a kinship caregiver, resources were unavailable when I cared for my nieces and my nephews. And when I asked about resources, I was informed just to put my niece and nephew's parents on child support. When my family took care of my child, they were told the same thing by the state of Florida. So like others and myself as well, we were unaware of the resources that were available for providing kinship care. And the obstacles that I feel families have faced in kinship care is, excuse me, the significant issue with providing the kinship care is none of the providers, I'm sorry, I got tongue-tied, is they have to undergo the same procedures that foster care providers do, which has always left me with the one question was, why is kinship care provider going through the same process to become a kinship caregiver? I'm so sorry, I got nervous, you guys. Why is nothing created differently for the process to be more straightforward with a kinship caregiver? We must keep kinship caregivers with, we need to create, a different process for kinship caregiver providers so that they can step up and provide kinship care for those when family members come into custody. In my eyes, we need to invest in families a little more. And it is now time to start educating folks on the process and resources that are available for you if you become a kinship care provider. I'm gonna hand over to Heidi right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. We really appreciate you opening us up because honestly, we love that you have multiple perspectives on this issue. So this is going to be a bit informal. It's all good. So my name is Heidi Rutledge Epstein. I'm from the ABA Center on Children and the Law. Many people are familiar with the American Bar Association, but don't know that we have a public interest arm, which is at the Center on Children and the Law is part of. We work on a lot of different issues to support justice for children and families. We're about 20 attorneys. We're mainly grant funded, and we work to coalition build and collaborate. Really happy to be here. Want to thank the Children's Trust Alliance and the Birth Parent National Network for inviting us. Want to thank Casey Family Program for the support they have of the work that we do around kinship care. And really, really want to thank all of you for joining us today. As Christina and Meryl both indicated, you all have very busy lives, busy schedules. So taking time out today to talk to us, we really appreciate it. I see that there are a lot of kinship experts on the line on this webinar, so we will appreciate your perspective as well. So I'm going to turn it over to, as I call her, my partner in crime, Anna Beltran.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you, Christina, for sharing. It's such an important perspective that you bring to today's discussion. So I am Anna Beltran. I'm the director of Generations United's newest Technical Assistance Center on the Families. Generations United is a national nonprofit that's been around for a long time now, and we're located in Washington, D.C., and we do intergenerational work. But we've also focused on grand families and kinship families, and we use those terms interchangeably to mean grandparents, other relatives, and close family friends who raise children when parents can't. Since the late 90s. And we've had a national center on grand families that does a number of things, as you'll see there. Probably most importantly, elevating the voices of the caregivers themselves so that they can really drive what we do. Since last fall, almost a year now, we received a cooperative agreement from the Administration for Community Living to run the first ever Technical Assistance Center on the Families. And on the next slide, you'll see a little bit about that new Technical Assistance Center. We received the 5 years, $10 million. We're doing this with 5 national partners, an array of subject matter experts, including Heidi. And we're really working with the systems. So many of you that I see on the chat are already part of this work. If you're not, and you're in one of these 8 systems that are listed on this slide, or you're a kinship navigator, or you're really trying to help support the families, or you're a caregiver who's trying to help support other families, please join us. And you'll see that's a QR code that you can put your phone up there and to sign up for a newsletter. And I'm just thrilled to be with you all today. And thank you, Meryl and the Birth Parent Network, for inviting Heidi and me. So getting into the meat of the matter, really the value of kin. And like Christina said, it is incredible, the value and the fact that they're not supported. So if you go to the next slide or two, I believe the next slide is a title slide. you will see what we refer to as kinship care. And I believe I've already pretty much told you this, but it does occur naturally in families. You know, this goes back from the dawn of time, grandparents and other relatives stepping up. You know, it takes a village, raising children when parents can't. It also includes, in our definition, victive kin. It's kind of an unfortunate phrase, but it means people who are really close to the child and the family, but aren't necessarily blood related to the child. If you go to the next slide, you will see that kinship care is prevalent. The big number there, the 7.6 million, and our data really at the national level is not as good as it should be. But 7.6 million children who live with a grandparent or other relative who's head of the household. So meaning they're the renter or the owner of the home. So they may be providing most of the caregiving, or the parent may be there providing most of the caregiving. So we really don't know. But they're 3-generation homes at least. The 2.6 million number of children are those that don't have a parent in the home. So we know that the relative or the kin is doing the caregiving. And then finally, the smallest number is those children who are in kinship foster care, meaning the child's in the legal custody of child welfare agency, not necessarily that the relative is licensed foster parent. And it doesn't look like a huge number, but it's actually over 1/3 of the foster care system. So very important kinship foster care. But as you will see here, that the majority of the caregivers are really outside of child welfare involvement. And that's why it's so important that child welfare look at the other caregivers as well, develop their kinship navigator programs to serve the other caregivers and the other children as well. On the next slide, you'll see that the increase in the reliance of child welfare and foster care on relatives and kin. And we're seeing it growing and growing, and there's been a federal preference for placing children with kin for almost 30 years now. So it's important, but what's equally important and what we're not seeing is what Christina said, is that these families are not supported like non-related foster parents are. So that is something we all have to work on. On the next slide, you will see that the value, right? This is based on decades of research that really show that children thrive with kin for a lot of reasons that are common sense. You know, they know their culture, they know the family, they know their roots, they maintain better connections to siblings, but also things that are less obvious or common sense, like better mental health outcomes, better behavioral health outcomes, more stability. A great likelihood of achieving permanency. 35% of children who are adopted from foster care are adopted by relatives. So, so a lot of strengths. And I'm going to turn it to Heidi to tell you about some of the challenges.
Thanks, Anna. So if we can go to the next slide. The importance of engaging the whole family. So let's start with, you know, we heard from Anna as to why it's so important to keep family involved. But what are some of the challenges that kinship caregivers face? There are a lot of assumptions and myths, like the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, or why should we, pay kin, etc. Complicated family relationships. Families are complicated. We all know that. So when you start changing roles and who's the caregiver and who was grandma is now the child's caregiver, that gets complicated. Foster home approval process, we're going to talk about that. And that's absolutely what Christina alluded to. Anytime you're trying to put together a system that was designed for non-kin and make kin fit into that, it is definitely that round peg in the square hole. We lack kin-specific services and supports, trying to kind of treat them like all care providers. Families typically have a lack of information in their fear systems and don't really want to ask for support and help. Housing can be an issue, especially if you've got caregivers in senior-only housing. Lack of legal services. We know in these cases, the child often has an attorney, the parent almost always should have an attorney. The agency often has an attorney, but who's missing at the table is often the kinship caregiver with an attorney. Mental and physical health of both the child and the caregiver, and making sure that those supports and services are available to support the whole, what we call triad. The kin, caregiver, the child, and the parent is really, really important. So kind of acknowledging that this is a naturally occurring thing that happens in an unnatural system of child welfare, so that there are going to be challenges as we go forward. All right, next slide, please. So key steps to engagement with kin. And it's not just about engagement with kin. We really talk about engagement with the whole family, the whole concept that Anna said of it takes a village. So in order to do that, you have to find them. So identifying and locating them early, asking the child, asking the parent, making sure we're including both maternal and paternal, because you can't engage and work with the whole family if you haven't found them. Okay. And then that engagement piece, making sure that they're not just receiving some form letter in the mail that they're going to toss out, making sure that there's actually some form of engagement. And I really believe with these two steps, the identify, locating, and engaging, everybody has a role to play in the system with having that happen. And it's not just on the agency, it's on everybody involved. It's on the parent to speak up about their preferences. It's on the child to speak up about their preferences. It's on their attorneys to kind of let those preferences be known. We need to make sure that that placement is the right placement for the child if they cannot safely be with the parent. Making sure that there's a commitment on the part of the caregiver. Making sure that if family cannot engage, that they are staying connected to the child as a non-placement resource. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Providing support and training. And then I think most importantly, avoiding what we call the late arriving relative or parent who didn't know. They did not know the child was involved in the system. They step up at the end, and some states have decided that's too late. They're bonded to a foster parent, and we're looking at permanency with a non-relative. And obviously that's a concerning issue. So really making sure that we're working together as a community to make sure that that family is being engaged in a meaningful way. All right, next slide, please. So when we're talking about placement of a child because they can no longer safely be with the parent, there are obviously a lot of differing perspectives to consider. The parent may or may not be supportive of a kin caring for their child rather than a stranger. And that has to do with a lot of different conflicting feelings and the family dynamics. They may not want the family to know what's happening. They may have negative feelings about the family. It might be maternal versus paternal, but really making sure that we're understanding the different perspectives and respecting the parents' wishes and understanding why. So if they say, for instance, I don't want the child placed with their maternal aunt, asking in a supportive way, why? Can you kind of talk to me about that? Looking to the child to help identify who's important to them, who has been in their life, who do they want to continue to stay important to their life, who might they want to live with. The kinship caregiver, are they supportive of reunification? I think that is really, really important. Looking at that relationship between the proposed kinship caregiver and the parent to make sure that they understand that the goal is reunification and that they are supportive of that goal and will be supporting any kind of permanency and hopefully reunification for the child. But are they committed that if the child cannot continue to live with the parent, that they will provide a permanent home for the child and keep the family involved? But then we get into a lot of the things that we're going to talk about in a few minutes about the hoops that they have to jump through if they're coming into the formal child welfare system to be considered a placement option. And then finally, the caseworker's perspective. They want to make sure that these are stable placements. And there obviously are times when they do have that, as I said, that myth of the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, or, oh boy, I know this family, they've been in the system for generations. There can't possibly be a kinship caregiver out there who can help this family. And so really trying to combat bad past experiences with the belief that the child will do better when placed with kin. The children do thrive when they're with family. So we have, as you can see, there are different and sometimes competing perspectives when deciding a best placement for a child, but to make sure that we kind of all understand all those perspectives have to be taken into consideration. Next slide. And then we have the law that comes in that says, okay, you got to place siblings together. You should place with kin. They shouldn't change school. You have to think about the child's needs and they have to be close to the parent. So we've got all these at times competing interests to find the perfect placement. And so I often get asked this question, which of these factors is the most important? And there's no good answer to that question. So really making an individual analysis for that specific child based on all these factors of what is really the best placement for the child if, for whatever reason, they can't be with the parent. Obviously, always circling back to why can't we just put services in the home and keep them with the parent? But if for whatever reason they can't be, let's make sure that every case is being assessed individually. And ultimately, the court really is a deciding factor in which is the best placement under best interest. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn it back over to Anna to go through these complicated options.
Thank you, Heidi. Yes, and it is complicated. If you look at the next slide, you'll see kind of the two sides of this, right? So the child's been placed, like Heidi has talked about. They weighed all those factors. They placed the child with the kin, wherever that be. And then it's like, which way do you go, right? So basically on this flow chart, the agency has legal custody. But we're also going to talk about those situations that we talked about and the big numbers, right, of those children who are not necessarily in the legal custody of foster care as well. But mostly this flow chart addresses those that are in the legal custody or that have kind of been diverted, for lack of a better word, or put on some kind of safety plan with perhaps some services through the Family First Prevention Services Act to try to get them stabilized. And then how these children achieve permanency. And of course, on both sides, on all sides, really the ultimate goal is to get them back with the parents if that's safe. And so, we encourage kin to work with parents, parents to work with kin. It really is a whole family approach here. So on the next slide, you'll kind of see what, I don't usually use this term, informal kinship care, but we're using it here in a very specific way. And that means when a relative or kin is temporarily caring for a child informally, meaning there's no legal relationship with that child, there's no child welfare agency involvement. So that's one situation. Then the other situation is where the child welfare agency encourages the parent to allow the child to live with the kin without agency involvement. Or maybe the agency didn't even encourage the parent. The kin stepped up and the parent agreed. Or the parent really wanted the kin to just take them and not get child welfare involved. So that's kind of what we usually call kinship diversion, where the agency knows about the family and the child, but it doesn't take them into legal custody. And then the final thing is where the agency is somewhat involved and they've done a safety plan and are trying to, they're somewhat involved. That hidden foster care, we only have that because there is a lot of talk using that phrase. We don't necessarily like that phrase or use that phrase much, but it's there just for a reference point, really. So on the next slide, in terms of informal, so with that very specific definition that we just went through, so some agency involvement or no agency involvement and no legal relationship with the child. Because unlike parents, the kin don't have an automatic legal rights and responsibilities over a child, right? A parent has those inherent legal rights and responsibilities. And for kin to get them, either the child welfare agency has to have the legal custody and then the kin can access services and supports, or the relative gets some type of legal relationship. So this is basically no legal relationship, right? So kin has just stepped up. So with the right supports, this may totally work on a temporary basis without any kind of child welfare involvement or government involvement, but it can be hard to make those daily decisions, especially if the parent's not easily accessible. So how do you then enroll them in school, consent to health care, etc.? The kinship caregiver may be able to apply, may be encouraged to apply for temporary assistance for needy families, particularly the child-only grants, which in most states just look at the child's income and the child. Now, one of the problems was elevated by Christina, which is that the caregiver is asked to assign their right to collect child support to the state. Now, most caregivers don't want to do this. Either they're afraid of the parent, which can happen, unfortunately, but mostly what we hear is the caregiver, often the grandparent, wants their adult child to be able to reparent and knows that if they have this financial obligation hanging over their head, they're not going to be able to stabilize their housing and their situation. So they don't want the state to go after the parent. And so therefore they don't apply. And this can be, this is ongoing, the only source of really ongoing financial support for families who aren't licensed foster parents. So it's an important resource, but we have this child support assignment. We also have it on the foster care side, But there's an interesting letter that came out recently from the Administration for Children and Families at the federal level, encouraging states to not require that assignment for foster care. I'm going to drop that link in the chat because I think it's really worth elevating. And honestly, it kind of slid right past me. And it was one of our grand voices that elevated that to us. The kin might be safe. The child might be safe with the kin. Everything's safe and stable, but the kin might not meet that state's licensing requirements. You know, some states have very strict licensing requirements, or maybe it's not even strict. That's not the right word. Kind of nonsensical in some states, in some places. And honestly, kin might not be encouraged to become licensed. But anyway, in this situation, you know, it might just not be. You don't want to get into that situation of having them say you're not safe as a kinship caregiver. By keeping the child out of the formal system, you're really not alerting anyone to there's a family issue. The safety plan can allow time for the parent to resolve some things and the child to be returned to the parent without any government or system or court getting involved. So those are some significant benefits to many families. And all these options really have to be weighed out with, as Heidi said, the triad. You know, the parent, the child, and the caregivers have to be at the table together, really deciding what works best for the family. And it's our role as professionals to really lay out the options and to help guide them, but not influence them too much. So in terms of considerations for this kind of informal thing, they may be unfairly pressured to go this route. Without the protections of foster care and the child welfare agency, there's not that support for the parent and the services for the parent to be able to reunify perhaps. And they don't, the parents don't have legal representation through the child welfare agency like they would if there was an open case. So there can be some concerns there because who's the lawyer representing my interests? Like I said, the kin don't have a legal relationship automatically. That can impact services. And there's really no data on this whole big mix of families in this big informal umbrella that we're talking about. So how are they doing, right? Next slide, please. So kinship foster care. So this is when you go into child welfare. The child goes into the child welfare agency's legal authority, and they have the legal authority, the legal custody of the child. But there are a lot of things on the kinship side that can happen, and it really depends on your state. In some states, if the child is in the legal custody of the state, that's it. Grandma's got to get licensed. In some states, grandma doesn't even get the option to be licensed. In some states, they just approve grandma in a really cursory way and don't support her, don't give her foster care maintenance payments. So it's just a super big hodgepodge out there, as I'm sure we all know. What ideally should happen is that there should be this, the options should be laid out. These families should be supported. They should be able to get licensed through the waiver authority, which the feds allow, the federal government allows anything non-safety related on licensing standards to be waived for kin. And it's important to know that states determine what's safety and non-safety. The only thing the feds say about safety is Adam Walsh criminal and child welfare, child abuse background checks. And Adam Walsh Act, the federal law, is very prescribed. It basically says if grandma's been convicted of a violent felony, or grandma's had a drug-related felony within the last 5 years, then grandma can't be a foster parent. But states go to all kinds of extremes with that and then blame the feds for it. So know that the actual federal safety is pretty limited, and states have a lot of control in what they can waive and what they can call non-safety. Next slide, please. So what are some benefits of getting involved with the child being involved with the child welfare system and the kin being involved with the child welfare system? And how do you balance, if you're given the option as a kinship caregiver, being licensed or not being licensed, and what does that look like? So in terms of benefits for the family and for the whole triad, is that there's supports and services through the agency. So there's foster care maintenance payments to help meet the needs of the child. There may be assistance for other expenses. There are those lawyers that we talked about for the parent and for the child, sadly not for the kinship caregiver, and it's not required. Medicaid for the child. And if the kin or anyone really adopts that child from foster care, they will likely be able to get adoption assistance. And if the kin get guardianship of that child from foster care and they're licensed, they'll be able, maybe if the state has it, to take kin gap, which is guardianship assistance. And that would be monthly help to the family to help meet that child's needs. Also, there are independent living services for older youth, and their educational and training vouchers for older youth, which doesn't exist outside of foster care. And that reasonable and prudent parent standard that now exists under federal law allows caregivers or any foster parent to make daily decisions for the child that are reasonable. Like, oh, can the child come over on a sleepover? Yes, grandma can make that decision theoretically without checking with the child welfare agency. What does the family need to consider, right? Well, even if they're not licensed, even if grandma's not licensed, she's going to be subject to all the rules and regulations of the child welfare system because the child's in their legal custody. So caseworker visits, routine court visits, court appearances, following the rules and regulations, adhering and usually supervising any kind of visitation with parents or other family members. Also the fear, it's real. I asked Christina, I'm sure, and so many other families, that the agency is just going to come in and do something random, like pull the kid out and put them with somebody else, or, they're in their legal custody, right? So they can do what they feel is best. Now, if the kin aren't licensed, we encourage everyone in the triad to ask why not. Why not? And did they get their options? Did they understand their options? Or did the caseworker say, you don't want to be licensed, do you? We're going to have to come into your house, measure your windows, get all up in your business. Well, guess what? They're already up in your business. So you might as well get the support that comes with being licensed. The kin might not want the child labeled as a foster child and change the relationship with the parent or child. So that's got to be balanced. So anyway, just kind of a lot of things to think about as a birth parent, as a caregiver, as the child, and of course, as the professionals who help the families. Next slide, please. So this is kind of enlightening, although sadly, the numbers are more than 10 years old. But this was the last time these numbers were crunched on a national basis. They looked at every TANF child only, temporary assistance for child only rate in the country, and every minimum foster care maintenance payment rate in the country, the average minimum, and compared them. And as you can see, and particularly when you get up to more than one child, the disparity in financial support is significant. And most of us can't take on another child without extra income. It's a lot to ask of families. So I want caregivers, I want us all to encourage caregivers not to use the phrase, I don't need to be paid or pay caregivers. We're not paying caregivers. We're supporting the children who are in the care of these caregivers. And that guilt needs to go away because this is a lot to ask of people. And most of us don't have that kind of extra income lying around. So you can see the difference in support. Next slide, please. Legal custody or guardianship. Okay, so now you are either in foster care or you're not in foster care as the child and the family. You've been diverted, you haven't been diverted, you're licensed, you're not licensed. This is kind of a generic slide to cover just legal custody or guardianship, whether it be private or through the agency. But in general, the kin has to say, I want this relationship. Although in some states, the agency really does kind of file it and they work through their lawyers. But, the kin and the family has to agree kind of thing. And then you may be able to apply for public benefits that perhaps you didn't have with legal custody or guardianship, although really it shouldn't impact much getting that relationship. Housing, public housing, it tends to impact, although it shouldn't. But that's a story for another day. There could be Kinship Navigator programs that can help. Allie Caliendo is going to tell us about her fabulous Kinship Navigator program that can really walk through what these legal relationships look like and what services and supports are available. Now, with this legal relationship, although it gives the caregiver legal authority over that child to make decisions, it gives rights and responsibilities, everything really short of
No, give me
everything short really of
yep.
is that just interference or is someone trying to tell me something?
It sounds like interference. Trish, are you able to
Give me the
mute
Thank you.
that? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's see if I can regain my train of thought. So it basically gives the caregiver rights and responsibilities over the child, pretty much everything short of agreeing to a name change, that kind of thing, or agreeing for the child to be adopted. Parents still have to be consulted with that. But parents do retain some of their rights and responsibilities, and they can typically go to the court, although this varies so much around the country. But anyway, they can typically go to the court and ask for the court to reinstate their legal custody or their rights and responsibilities, but they have to usually show some kind of change in their situation. So it's not as permanent as, say, adoption, which we'll also talk about. Next slide, please. So what is the balance here? And this slide, we're really going to talk about the private one. So this is where the child welfare agency is not involved. That 18 children that are in the care of kin for every one that's in the care of the child welfare system with kin. So the bulk of the families. So the benefits for the family are, the court, the agency, everybody's out of your hair. The caregiver and child may be eligible for more supports, services, may be able to access more. There's that legal authority that the caregiver now has because they don't have an automatic legal rights and responsibilities like a parent does, but the parent still has some parental rights and they can seek visitation and they can petition again for that reinstatement in most instances of the legal custody. Now, but what are the downsides? Well, the caregiver's got to pay for, in general, attorney fees, court filing fees. This takes time. It takes money. They may be required to assign child support, like we talked about, to receive that temporary assistance for needy families. They may be able to adopt down the line, but they won't be eligible for that adoption assistance because they're not adopting from foster care. The agency is, pretty much out of the picture. And because the agency is out of the picture, they won't be able to get KinGAP, that guardianship assistance we talked about. They won't be able to get adoption assistance because the agency is out of the picture. So it's really important, again, that all the options for that particular family in that particular state or particular territory be discussed and they really understand it, because this is some complicated stuff. And at the national level, all we can do really is broad stroke it, because all these laws, legal custody laws, guardianship laws, adoption laws are created at the state level. So next slide, please. So this guardianship assistance that I've been talking about a little bit, or at least alluding to, is a program that's been around since the 2008, basically, and it gives states and territories and tribes that run a Title IV-E agency, which means a federally supported child welfare agency, the option to take this program and to say, okay, we're going to use our federal child welfare money, our 4E money, to offer guardianship assistance. But we have to do it in a way that complies with what the feds have told us we got to do. And there's some serious eligibility criteria, which we'll get to on the next slide. But basically, this is the child and the caregiver exiting foster care. So the child was in the legal custody agency. Grandma was licensed. They exit, and they can get up to the foster care maintenance payment rate until the child ages, becomes a majority, and a few exceptions. So if that can happen, the child is still eligible for Medicaid. This guardianship assistance continues even if the guardian moves. These payments can be made on behalf of eligible siblings, and that definition can be broad of siblings, and it's state determined. of the eligible child. So the child, if that child's eligible and got KinGAP, the siblings in the same home, even if they're not eligible, can get KinGAP. And if the child was eligible for federal adoption assistance, if grandma, who becomes a guardian, later decides she wants to adopt, she can get that adoption assistance. And there's some legal fees that will be reimbursed as well under federal law. So what are the eligibility criteria? Well, on the next slide, you'll see caregiver's got to be licensed. There's got to be a close relationship, some kind of relationship with the grandma or the caregiver and the child. And I just use grandma because that's most prevalent, the most common caregiver. And it's just easier to talk that way. The child has have to live in the licensed relative home for 6 months consecutive. Reunification, this is important for parents to know. Reunification with parents and adoption have to be not options for that child. So the agency, the triad, everybody's had to talk about this and say, reunification is not possible, adoption is not possible. And then this becomes an option. And it's an important option for a lot of kinship caregivers and a lot of families because they don't want to turn grandma into mom and mom into sister. So this is an important option for exiting foster care with a stable situation. The agency is supposed to discuss the guardianship with the parents and, all these other things. And then the 4E eligibility, which of course is that financial piece. So the child has to have been removed from a home that was 4E eligible, basically that was quite poor. But many states use state funds to provide similar program for those children who aren't Title 40 eligible. So that's an important thing for the families to know about and ask about. Oh, is there a state program? Next slide, please. Moving on to the benefits and the considerations of this. Really, the reason guardianship assistance came about is because there were a lot of children staying in foster care with relatives and with kin because they couldn't afford to exit. They were safe, they were stable, but they couldn't afford to exit because they needed that ongoing financial support. But meanwhile, they were costing courts time, caseworker visit time, and they didn't need it. They were safe, they were stable. So this is a way for those children to exit foster care into a safe and loving home and still get that financial assistance that's needed. Benefits from the perspective of the triad, the kinship triad, the birth parents, the child, and the caregiver, is that you don't have to do termination of parental rights, which is very important for a lot of families. And those options need to be available. On the consideration side, who's suitable for this kind of legal relationship, guardianship, exiting foster care. And it's all of these things. It's children with the strong bond to parents who don't want to change that relationship legally. It's those kinship caregivers who feel kind of similarly and they don't want to change the legal relationships. Could be parents with severe disabilities who can't parent but are really important to that child, but they can't do the daily kind of, changing diapers or whatever it be. So,
Anna,
yes.
this is Meryl, and we do have a couple of questions in the chat. So I just was trying to figure out how we might weave those questions in as we move forward before we do any of the breakouts. So just something to give some thought to, maybe you and Heidi and also Allison, in terms of how we might want to respond to these.
Yeah, I think we can pause at the end of this and look at those two questions.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Thank you all. All right, next slide, please. In terms of adoption, this really is the most permanent. It changes the legal relationships among the family. It turns mom into sister and grandma into mom. The parental rights are going to be terminated if they're in the child welfare agency. On the private side, it's an option if the parents are gone or if they voluntarily surrender or they're terminated, their rights are terminated. So in some states, the parents can go back and get parental rights reinstated, but it's really narrow and it's only some states. So this really does change the relationships in that family, legally and permanently. Next slide, please. So what are some of the benefits and what are some of the considerations? And again, really every family is their own best expert. So what we should do as professionals is just lay out everything and let them ask questions and really try to understand not only the legal and practical ramifications, but also the financial ramifications, which I guess is practical. But all of the, especially adoption, really does impact things like once you adopt, you can't get temporary assistance for needy families because you're the parent. Things like that are very important to understand. So some of the benefits are the child is going to automatically inherit from the adoptive parent, but they won't automatically inherit anymore from the birth parent. So that, but the birth parent can create a will and transfer that way. There's more control, the visit, especially over the parental visitation, which can be a challenge for some caregivers. And it's seen as more permanent. There's a federal adoption tax credit which if you adopt from foster care, you take the whole amount regardless of showing expenses. And I think this year it's about $14,000, it's almost $15,000. And if you adopt privately without child welfare involvement, you have to show expenses, but you can also deduct up to that amount. This used to be refundable. It's no longer refundable, but if you owe taxes, it's a benefit. Also, if you adopt from foster care, there's adoption assistance. But if you didn't adopt from foster care or you were diverted from foster care, it's almost impossible to get that adoption assistance. Although I have talked to some lawyers who've been quite clever and gotten it for children who have been diverted, but it's extremely tricky. Some of the many considerations is we've talked about them, is it right? Do we want to change family relationships? What's the tension? Is the judge is making the decision about what's best interest of the child. If you adopt from the child from foster care, there's got to be a termination of parental rights. That could take a long time. So all these things to really consider as you're presenting it in a balanced way or considering it in a balanced way. Next slide, please. So we have created with Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption Support some charts. We have a number of state-specific charts now, I think about 15 or so, and they compare adoption and guardianship, mostly for families that are in the foster care system, although a lot of the principles apply privately as well without child welfare system involvement. So there's a national chart if you don't have a state-specific, but you can access them here free of charge and share them with your family, share them with yourself. And consult them. Hopefully they're of help. Next slide, please.
So before we go to that, Anna, I'm going to kind of buzz through the questions and give you a minute to look in the chat because you've been busy giving us lots of great information. So let me see what I can cover for you and feel free to chime in as well, Anna, please. So I'm going to go backwards up, but it says, someone wrote, Oklahoma reserves the right for adopted child to continue automatically inherit from the terminated birth parent. I think that's really interesting. And I hadn't heard that in many other states. In Maryland, it looks like in order to pursue custody and guardianship, there has to be an agreement among the parent, the agency, and the child's counsel that it's the only option, which also is interesting. We have seen states looking at requirement of parental consent for care and custody or kin gap or guardianship. And I have to admit, it's always nice when the parent's on board, but it is not a federal requirement. The parent has to consent to that typically. So that looks like in Maryland, that is a state requirement. Takes me back to my days of practicing in Maryland years ago. That used to be a requirement. Kind of surprised to see it's still there. The other question is if adoption can the kin caregiver choose guardianship, kin gap instead of adoption? Absolutely. And those are those conversations you really want to have and push for, and for the attorneys to push for, because many agencies default to the concept that adoption is more permanent, therefore we're going to push for adoption. That is not the only option. The fact that there is a subsidized guardianship program in most of the states, but for maybe 5 or 6 at this point, tells us that we realize the validity and the value of something short of adoption. And I believe it's a fantastic option. And so no, this is where we have to push back. And it kind of goes to the question above that says, what do we do? What's the enforcement of some of these policies and grievances? Because agencies are stuck in their old ways, things like pushing adoption and only adoption. Honestly, the grievance process and the oversight committees, being a part of the process in your state and taking an active role before, we run into the problems is obviously the best solution. But on an individual case basis, it's really making those arguments about what's in the best interest of the child. It's to be connected to relatives, just to place with relatives. It's if they can't be with the parent, to have permanency to relatives, and to make sure that we're not pushing relatives into doing things that they're not ready or comfortable to do, and that's not the most supported avenue. As far as the grievance process, I mean, there's obviously always appeals for TPR. There is a grievance and an appeal process in many states if kin are denied a license, but they don't often know about that process to appeal the denial. So I don't know if I kind of caught them all. I'm going to let Anna, I'm going to keep going through the questions and say, Anna, is there anything else you want to add to anything I mentioned?
Yeah, no, just that. This is an important discussion and it goes to the point that we can only do so much when we talk about these options at the national level, because they do vary so dramatically. Like I'm seeing the permanent guardianship, which does exist in other states besides Oklahoma, where it's almost an adoption. So it's very important to consult and to work with the local lawyers, the laws, and consult what's available. But in terms of broad brush, also to kind of know what to ask, what's out there, and what.
So Heidi
Yeah.
and Anna, one of the other considerations though that I read and I'm not sure how to pronounce this, Jessa Thompson's comment in here is looking at are birth parents involved in some of these oversight committees so that they can have some input into the directions that these move. This would be something that the Birth Parent National Network members would be interested in knowing, because we see that sometimes adoption or guardianship may be the options, but our goal also would be to focus on reunification
Sure.
as much as possible. So I guess I just want to kind of make sure we're responding to Jess's
I think we can
questions
discuss
that way.
Yeah, and I think we can have that discussion in our breakout rooms.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think that's
clarify a little more on that too if needed. Like, I was just trying to type it real fast for you, but
Great. Thank you. Appreciate that. And I think the only other thing that I may not have gotten to, and I apologize, I didn't get to all of the questions because they were all very good ones, is about the kind of safety plan as a reasonable effort they're expected to do. Honestly, we could have a 2-hour at least webinar just on the use of safety plans and the appropriate use of safety plans and due process consideration for the parents, and the fact that some states use safety plans, some don't, the whole concept of hidden foster care. But the bottom line is, safety plan or not, states are supposed to, under federal law and policy, be providing preventive services to not remove the child and keep the child in their home. And so whether that's some sort of safety plan to keep the child with the parent or a safety plan to put them with the relative but quickly return them to the parent, the reality is we all know it looks different in all the states. There are states that this is happening for months and months, and there are states this only happens for a few days. So as I said, this is kind of a big topic to talk about, but I hope I kind of addressed at least initial questions about it. I would actually suggest perhaps this be a topic for another webinar for the Birth Parent Network, is hidden foster care, because it is certainly a big topic here. So we are going to move on. Anything we didn't cover, please bring them up in the breakout rooms. I think there'll be great discussions. Okay, so this slide, basically the other thing I wanted to bring up is that there is a role for kin to play to support the family that is not a placement or permanency role, but just a supportive role, whether that's to maintain connection with children, keep them connected to their culture, help with their treatment, be part of their treatment and permanency planning. If they're in congregate or residential care, they can support the parents. What does the parent need? Maybe the parent needs some transportation. Just support through this whole process, because we all know this is a traumatic process for everybody to go through. So making sure that we understand and acknowledge that there are roles for kin to play that are short of placement, but are still very important. So, all right. Next slide, please. So race equity in the Indian Child Welfare Act, we can move on to the next slide. So we know that children from African American, Black, and Native American Indian, and Alaska Native families are overrepresented in the system. They're also overrepresented in kinship families for that reason, but supported by kin when they enter the system. So this is just to give you kind of a sense of the breakdown of racial overrepresentation in what we call grand families. Great, next slide, please. But what I do want to acknowledge is kinship is often seen as a very important strategy for race equity because it honors the communities of color by trying to preserve those family ties, preserve the culture, preserve the heritage. It, you know, the family, the historic basis of child welfare is family separation. And so that obviously often impacts families of color. So really making sure to understand that by keeping them with kin, we are trying to preserve that culture. It also is a great strategy to prevent group placement and overrepresentation of youth of color who are in group care, group homes, congregate care, et cetera. And then I do want to just point out one really important cultural practice, and that's tribal cultural adoption, which can happen for Native American children, is a good example. They don't terminate the parental rights, but they do a tribal cultural adoption. Generations United has fantastic racial equity toolkits. There's a link there, and I really want to encourage you to look at those. Next slide is talking a little bit about ICWA, and I see there's a question in the chat, but I think I'm going to cover it. So ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, allows the tribe and requires the tribe to intervene if notified appropriately, requires active efforts to prevent removal, and has specific placement preferences for American Indian and Alaska Native children who are entering care, to really look at tribes, to look at the tribal family as a whole, to make sure that the children are being, if they can't be with the parent again safely, make sure that they're staying within the tribe. So that's really kind of a very quick and dirty explanation of ICWA, which again could be its own webinar. So, okay, I am going to turn it over to Allie, who's going to tell us about some of her fantastic programs that are happening in Nevada.
Hi, thank you so much. Hope you can hear me okay. My name is Allie. You can go to the next slide, please. And I am the founder and director of Foster Kinship, which is the Navigator program in the state of Nevada. And I see that there are a lot of Navigator programs on the call today, and I am especially issuing a challenge to all of us who work in kinship support. If you've seen me present before, we do a lot of things for kin, including navigation, support, respite care, training, and our whole model is on our website. It's all available if you're interested in learning more. But the one thing that Foster Kinship focuses on, based on what you've already seen, is we want to make sure that families have accurate information at the right time, and then they can make the best decision for their family. So over the course of the last decade, I have been a pretty vocal challenger of our child welfare system practices. And now I am challenging all of us in the Kinship Navigator space to think about how we can step up and address some of the issues that have already been raised by Anna and Heidi, because as Navigator programs, we support kids inside the system and outside of the system. And all of those outside of the system, the diversions, the hidden foster care, they're going to find us and work with us no matter what. So how can we better provide services to the whole triad when the child welfare system is not able to do so? So another thing I want to just briefly address is in a lot of my work, kinship child welfare professionals say that kin can be harder to work with than the traditional foster parents they might work with. They find that the kinship family dynamics can be challenging and fraught with conflict, and they maybe prefer not to deal with it. And so I want to share a little bit about how, if kinship families are to be a support for birth parents and for parents, their family, they need to be supported. And so on the next slide, I want to just briefly mention how we need to think about supporting kin really specifically so that they can be a support to the system and to the kids and the parents, and not be seen as oppositional or not in alliance with the systems that they're finding themselves in. If you are a kinship caregiver on this call, you probably have been in the position of getting that midnight phone call and being forced into making decisions that have with your family, and you're thrown into these systems without knowing all of the information. And a lot of times there's misinformation. And that is something that is not supportive. Kin can't be supportive if they are not supported. And it is the responsibility of all of us professionals to better support kin. The picture on the left is actually a picture of me and my husband on our adoption day. We are traditional foster parents, and we had every single support available to us. The red carpet was rolled out for us by the child welfare system. On the right is one of my very favorite kinship families, and they had a completely different experience. They didn't have any training, any financial support, any explanation of the difference between guardianship outside of the system, or if they were in foster care, should she get licensed? Should she do kin gap? Should she do adoption? She was completely on her own. And thank goodness we were able to connect and provide some services. But without programs in a lot of jurisdictions like foster kinship, families are making these decisions without all the information and without all the support. So the way I see it in terms of as professionals, there's a sort of a frontier of two things that we have to start really looking at in order to better support kin. The first is the caregiver's relationship to the child, and that explains some of the family dynamics, which I'll briefly talk about. And the second is the caregiver's relationship to the child welfare system. Are they in or out of that system? A few things that Nevada has done to make sure that there is more equity for kin on the next slide. One of the best things that Nevada is doing is partnering with foster kinship, if I can sort of be excited about it, because we're able to provide that third-party safe space to build trust with families and provide them that accurate information. And families do, we do get their trust because we are not the child welfare system. We don't have the badge, we don't have the ability to take and move kids. And most of the people that work at foster kinship are kinship caregivers who have some lived experience. And so we're able to really share and meet the families where they are while providing that accurate information at the right time so they can make good decisions for their families. Some of the things that we'd like to highlight, Nevada does have a kinship specific pre-licensing training that is shorter than what foster parents have to go through. And it's just kinship families and we do it. And so it's a lot easier and more supportive than being in a classroom with a bunch of, traditional foster parents who are so excited. Whereas kinship families come into training already having the kids in our state with just a lot of questions, grief, anger, loss, a lot going on, and it needs to be tailored to kin. All of our services include peer supports. We do an in-home program for every single new family that receives a child in their home. And when we're supporting them and stabilizing them with things like child-only TANF, and we're going to get their diapers and car seats to them right away, we're also helping them get through the licensing process as just a partner walking alongside them so that they're not on their own trying to figure it all out. Foster kinship, we offer quite a lot of things. And again, it's on our website. I don't want to spend too much time on it because I could spend all day talking about the ways that we do support kin. I want to talk more today because I think this is the right audience to challenge us to do way better than all of us are doing right now. So on the next slide, please. I think that those of us in this kinship professional space really should require of ourselves deep knowledge of two things. The first is really understanding the child's relationship to the kinship caregiver, and therefore the relationship between the caregiver and the parent and some of those family dynamics. And then the second is the child's relationship to the child welfare system. So as has already been explained, most kids are not in the child welfare system. They're outside kinship care. And then there's a small percentage of kids inside the foster care system. These numbers are for Nevada. So you can see that Anna's numbers of for every one child in the system, there are a whole lot more outside. It's absolutely true. Learning both of these will help you determine the appropriate interventions and strategies to holistically support the kinship family and ideally the triad. Navigator programs are designed usually to just provide support to the kinship caregiver and then sometimes services to the child. But I need us to push. We've got to push out and we've got to start providing more services to parents. Next slide, please. So the first thing to know and understand is the child's relationship to the kinship caregiver. These are numbers from Nevada. And what we are finding is that working with kinship families was starting to look very different. When I work with a maternal grandmother, it's different dynamics than when I'm working with an aunt. And it's definitely different dynamics if I'm working with fictive kin. And so what we've determined is the important lens of family systems theory on the work of supporting families. What we figured out, excuse me, in Nevada, is that there are mostly maternal grandmothers, but it's only 28%, right? So that's our largest population. And then we've got a group of aunts, and then fictive kin at 18%, and then our paternal grandmothers. So this makes up the majority of our casework. And we were really seeing different outcomes with maternal grandmothers, with paternal grandmothers, and with aunts, enough to the point where we've started really trying to tailor our interventions to the different family dynamics that we were seeing. Of course, fictive kin, they come in not part of the family system. So for us, it seems very more like supporting a traditional foster parent. They have totally different expectations when they first take children, and it is more in line with traditional foster parents. We also are very concerned about looking at these breakdowns in family structure, because what we find is that fictive kin and aunts have a much higher rate of disruption than our maternal grandmothers. So there's something going on in the family dynamics that I think is important to call out, because we are seeing different outcomes for kin based on this sort of breakdown. The other thing that foster kinship really cares about is, even though it's a very small percentage, when we have really young adult siblings who are taking kids, 18, 19, 20, 21, that is a totally different approach than if I'm working with a great grandmother who's taking kids. And a lot of times when we look at kinship support services, these differences aren't necessarily called out, and I think they need to be, because it does impact how you approach building that relationship with that family to support and get them the information that they need. Next slide, please. So we use family systems theory as a window into supporting kinship families. I don't have time to go into this in detail, but we do base our starting point of our intervention on Dr. Crumbly's 5 themes in engaging kinship caregivers, which is a fabulous resource for all of us in the field. But we like to go a little bit farther and think about how we need to engage families differently based on the kinship family type. I think if we just use our own family as example, you might think, you know, if something happens in your family, what are the different opportunities for all the different family members who may be asked to step up? You know, if my sister's child comes into care, it's going to look different if she is placed with me or placed with my mom. So if my sister has been struggling with addiction for many years and my mom and sister have a codependent relationship, that looks different than if the child is placed with me and I have years of anger and resentment towards my sister for kind of sucking all the energy out of the family system. And I'm just using this kind of real example in my own life so to explore how sometimes aunts can be perceived as very angry at the beginning. Maternal grandparents, I had a wonderful grandma who just came into my office this past week. And the first thing she said to me was, I know I enable my daughter. I'm like, okay, so we're starting from a point where she has some awareness that there are different opportunities in that dynamic to address than there would if that child was living with the aunt. So I'm just using these as simple examples. But a fun way to do it, if you've seen the movie Encanto, if you have kids in your house, I know you've seen it many times. I like to think about what would happen if one of the little kids was needing to go into kinship care. And you can kind of look at, you know, the different options in this family tree and look at what would be the opportunity and need to intervene differently in each of these placement options. So for example, Louisa, who is sort of the strong one in the family, who kind of everybody throws their troubles onto her, right? If you know that song, Surface Pressure, she feels like she's going to break. Her issues and the need to support her might look very different than if the child was placed with a grandma. So it's just sort of a fun thought exercise if thinking about your own family isn't as much fun like mine. I gave a presentation about thinking about family systems theory to our child welfare agency recently. And one of our placement workers who works with kin is like, oh, I think that maybe if I understand this better, I won't write off the aunt who, when I call to say, can you do this, is so angry at the beginning. Maybe I need to give that aunt time to process before I just say on to the next. And I was absolutely, that's how I think we can use this as kinship families to be into that supportive role first need to feel supported, and to support them, we have to understand what they're coming into the systems with. Next slide, please. The second really important thing is the child's relationship to the child welfare system, like we just saw in Heidi and Anna's slides. It's really interesting from a navigator perspective, because we serve everybody. All of those important things that are resources to families are really only available to a small subset of kids in kinship care. So in Nevada, 86% of our kinship kids are not in the child welfare system. They've either been in a private relationship or diverted out of the system. What is the path to reunification for kids who are not under the oversight and with all the legal protections of the child welfare agency? 86% of our kids who can't live with their parents and live with kin have none of that. So this is my ethical obligation and challenge to us in the navigator space. I think we need to start talking about this. Anna said there wasn't national data, and there isn't, but we do have data in our program. Only 10% of children in that private diverted category we see reunified, that like a natural reunification, versus the about 50 to 60% in our more formal side where the child welfare system is involved. That's a huge, huge difference. And I think we are ethically responsible to talking about it. The KinGap program that Nevada has, which is such an excellent option, and a lot of states tout it as this is a great option for kin, less than 2% of our kids are going to be eligible for that. So it's a small percentage of kinship where they can funnel into supportive services. And we have to start talking about how do we ethically approach kids getting back home, kids getting supported in all of these placement types, and just keep pushing it with our states and our jurisdictions. So final slide, please. And I'm sorry, I had to rush through this a little bit, but I just want to share that families have it in them to be the most foundational healing system for children. So there's the Japanese art form, I think it's kintsugi, I hope I'm saying that right, where they take broken pottery and fix it with gold, and that's that picture. And it's a beautiful thing where the metaphor for how family can come together and heal some of the trauma that has happened in their family system. And all of us who work with kin have to give the space for families to do that. And step one is to support the kinship family. They need to know what the systems they're working with, what their options are. They need to feel emotionally supported so that they can then be the best support for the child and for the child's parents, whatever that might look like. And so it's really important for all of us to do this work, to just consider those two things and start talking about how do we, in the informal space, think about getting kids back home, support for parents, and making sure that kids have equity, regardless of if they're in foster care or out. They have services that they need. We have to start demanding that for them. So I'll stop there, but very much appreciate the time to share a little bit.
Thank you, Allie. Appreciate your perspective and really love hearing everything that you're doing in Nevada and your organization is doing to support kin and for families. So, best laid plans. We had hoped to do some breakout groups, really focused on what can we do. And why don't we go to the next slide, just so you know where we were going with this. We were thinking of breaking into groups on licensing the use of kin and child welfare, the partnership between kin and parents, and finally, how to improve kinship practices in jurisdiction. I think we're going to just open it up to questions because you all have some really good ones. And if there is anything that you all want to contribute on these three topics, either suggestions, questions, I think these three potential breakout sessions that we had planned would be a great structure for us to have just a Q&A. So let me put you on the spot, Meryl, for a minute. Do we want to have people unmute and ask their question live? How would you like to handle that? Or raise hands? I guess I'm putting it to Trish.
So, yeah. I think that normally what we've done is we'll ask people to raise hands and we can unmute them if they choose to be unmuted, or they can just put their questions into the chat. So whichever way people feel most comfortable. So unless Trish, you have any other thoughts on that?
I think just seeing people post some questions in the chat will be probably the best way to utilize these next few minutes. I'm also wondering if we want to just stop screen share and give us a chance to look at each other and make a little connection.
You know what? This is, whoops, okay, that's fine. I was gonna say, we also have some resources we want to go over in the end, but we'll leave that. We'll come back to it.
Okay,
Fabulous, excellent. So I'm going to apologize if there were questions in the chat that we didn't get to. So if there are, perhaps you can retype them in.
so we are very open to questions at this point. Getting lots of positive feedback about excellent webinar and input that way. So any particular thoughts around some of the information that has been shared so far? I
Question
was,
that might stimulate some conversation while folks are putting their thoughts to paper. Do you see a trend of kinship care being easier and simpler than it was maybe 10 years ago? Are we trending in the right direction?
Well, it's certainly my dream. I do think we are. I will say, in my opinion, and love to hear Anna and Allie talk about this as well, but in my opinion, I think we are overcoming the hurdle of whether people really believe in that value of kin. I don't think we're having as much resistance to the concept of placing with kin. Now we just have to make it happen. And not only do we have to make it happen, which we are seeing the trend go in the right direction, placement is increasing, we have to support the kinship caregivers when they take the child into their home. That's the next kind of thing, big area to focus on and to really kind of push back. Anna, Allie, anything you want to add to that?
Well, I think that the talk about supporting kin and the resources for kin, everyone's talking about it now, but we need to push it in practice. We need to hold the line accountable. We need to make sure that kin are getting what they need and that the rights of parents are being respected in the process, especially with diversion practices. So while we talk about it, and I think that's way better than 10 years, we need to start really holding people's feet to the fire and asking for more.
so I'd like to ask a question in terms of just the building of the connections and the relationships between the kin and the birth parents, and just how do you see that working in the future? Because I think that's an issue that I think birth parents today struggle with, as well as kinship care providers. And how do we begin building some stronger connections? What are some strategies that you see as effective ways to do that?
I'll just quickly start. I think we can't deny the fact that family dynamics are different with kin than child welfare professionals are used to working with traditional foster parents. We have to start from a different point of view and acknowledge the emotions that are going to be there first. So how foster kinship does it is we build trust and rapport with the caregiver, and we allow space, a lot of space in our model for emotional support. And then we start talking about the needs of the child. And then we start talking about how that child needs their parents. And then we have that ability to draw that line back to getting that child home. So that's how we do it.
Thanks, Allie. Very helpful. We're getting a lot of comments in here.
Yeah,
I'll go ahead and step in with a question that Pasquale added or wrote in. So when I was working within the system, let me stretch this a little bit. So many family members were not given opportunity to raise their family members due to, let's say this example. Grandma had a marijuana charge when she was 23 and is now 53. And that charge is being used as reason for family members to not be allowed for the children to be placed. So, like always, states are not following policy. They are doing what they want. How can we utilize FFPSA, Family First Protection Services Act, if the people on the ground are not doing the work? Like Ali said, we need to make sure to hold people's feet to the fire and asking for more. So the question is, how do we utilize the FFPSA?
Well, two answers. One I put in the chat is a lot of states really are looking at those licensing standards that really make no sense as to whether it's an appropriate and safe home. So pushing the states. If the child's not with kin, ask why. Why is this child not being placed? Ask in court, ask in front of the judge, make sure your attorneys are jumping up and down, the child's attorney, the parent attorney, just keep asking. And if they say they didn't qualify for licensing, ask why not. What was the barrier? What was the reason they weren't licensed? Now, if the kin doesn't want to be licensed, it's a different story, but making sure you're talking to the kin about it and just put it in front of the court because, and know your policies and laws. A lot of states, you can waive some of this stuff and the caseworkers either aren't waiving it or some of them don't even know they can waive it. So asking the questions to the point where they see you walking into court, they're like, oh yeah, she's going to ask me about kin. She's going to ask me why they're not with kin, and she's going to ask me why I'm not using waivers. So make that common practice to ask those questions. Anna, you want to add anything?
I think you stated it perfectly.
All right. And Family First Prevention Services Act is telling them to do waivers. It's telling them to revise their model licensing standards. So you're absolutely right. And it's saying use prevention services.
Are you seeing the question in there?
Yes. About the fictive kin resources?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure, does everybody, could you clarify fictive kin real quick, Heidi? Just so, I don't know if everybody in the audience knows what that means.
Yeah, so I think Anna covered it in a slide that basically what we're talking about is not people who have a significant relationship to the child or family, but aren't a blood relative.
Okay.
So I do think that definition is being accepted by more states, and more states are loosening and broadening their definition to understand that there are people who are important to the child and the family that don't have a blood relation. So I do think we are seeing changes, slow but sure, changes in law and policy with regard to fictive kin. Let's see what else.
And you know, like we talked about a little bit, is that, you know, this is very state specific, whether or not the term relative includes fictive kin, which policies. So it's kind of a hodgepodge, even within a state, whether fictive kin are included, say, in TANF or included in for accessing kin gap. So we see a lot of practices.
Yeah.
I just mentioned in Nevada too, fictive kin are considered in the same category for our child welfare system. So all the resources for kin apply to fictive kin, but all of the resources outside of the system were different for fictive kin. So one of the things we advocated for were for fictive kin considered family in the child welfare system, they should be able to access kin gap. They should be able to access child only TANF. We had to do that legislatively, but we got it done because we need to see equity for all kids in kinship care, and they can't treat these people differently just because.
Yeah. And fictive kin can include people like this fabulous aunt we were talking to in Alabama, who's technically not the child's aunt anymore because she got divorced from the uncle who was really the blood relation. So fictive kin can include people like her.
Yep. And I want to address Justice's comment, which is a good one, that there's always a fear of speaking up because then you're going to be punished. And so, you know, it's not the end all to be all, but those of you who have attorneys, use them. That's your attorney's job. Your attorney's job is to advocate zealously for you and to push back. And especially if you're in a state with a child's attorney, band together to push that the kinship placement be the right placement. You know, I think that's really helpful. And as far as Megan's comment about reunification work outside the formal system, I agree. You know, we talk about that when the kin are diverted, or children are diverted to kin, that there's no clear path home to the parent sometimes. And that is a big consideration. That is a big concern. There are not the same services. There are not the same timelines. So although we really, you know, want to make sure we're respecting what the family wants, we want to make sure at all times that the parent is getting what they need for the child to come home. And so that is a big concern with when an agency kind of dump, what I call dump and run, you know, puts them with the relative, closes the case and moves on. How does the parent get the help they need to get them back? You know, couldn't agree with you more.
So guys, I'm sorry. It's just such great discussion here. I don't know whether Heidi and Anna and Allie may want to just do that wrap up in terms of resources real quick, and then we'll close out.
That'd be great. We want to tell you, you probably noticed in the upper right-hand corner, grandfamilies.org. So I just want to tell you that Anna and I, in partnership with KC Family Programs, have been working on a website for almost 15 years called grandfamilies.org, where all the resources that we reference are there. So please make sure that you visit the website for anything that you need. let us know if you have something you want to post on that website. So next slide. A tool that we just developed recently was something that really helped kin who are struggling to understand the different caregiving options available to them, the pros, the cons, the differences. And this is, although a very lengthy tool, it's a very detailed and important tool to try to understand different options for placement and permanency in caring for children, both inside and outside the system. I will say, as Anna said, we developed these tools from a national and broad perspective. So, but everything in there is generally applicable to your state, but obviously you have to drill down and see what your state laws support. Next slide. We did a series of briefs when Family First Prevention and Services Act came out to show how Family First could support the use of kin and should support the use of kin. So, encourage you to look at these briefs if you have like some of those great questions that were in the chat about the use of Family First to support kinship placements and families. Next slide. We have state fact sheets that are compiled and on this website for every single state in the country and the territories. We have a state fact sheet that gives you kind of resources for kinship caregivers in those states. Next slide. Our contact information, and I'm going to turn it back over to Meryl to bring us home.
Thank you. Well, I just really need to say, I'm not going to take too much time here at the end. I need to say a really, really big thank you to our wonderful presenters here today. So much great information was shared, so much valuable insights in terms of the different strategies to address things, but it's just all the considerations that you raised in terms of all of these different issues related to licensing versus non-licensing. And just the priorities and some of the major challenges that we're dealing with prioritizing kinship care placements. And I just think you have provided us all, Anna, Heidi, and Allie, as well as Christina. Thank you for opening us up and putting the context into place for us in the very, very beginning. And so thank you all for just a wonderful, wonderful presentation. There's so much more to continue in terms of discussion in the future. So we definitely want to come back and maybe address some of those breakout issues more in a discussion kind of way in the future. But I do want to say thank you to all. And I also want to say thank you to all of our participants that have been a part of today's webinar. Can you just bring up the next few slides, Sophia, just so that everyone is aware that we are, and I don't know, Chloe, if you could just share real quickly our Alliance Book Club and what we're doing with that, just like in a sentence or two.
Yes, thank you, Meryl. We have 2 new resources out that go along with the book, What Happened to You by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. One is a book club guide, and the other is a facilitator guide that those are for those that are interested in facilitating their own book clubs. And we do have 2 upcoming events. I'll drop the link in the chat to be able to register and see our work.
Thanks. Okay. And then I just want to remind people that Family Voices United is a collaborative effort between Generations United, Casey Family Programs, and the Children's Trust Fund Alliance. And it really is an effort to bring together the voices of youth, parents, and relative caregivers in terms of sharing their perspectives on how to improve our systems and, and also educating people around the Family First Prevention Services Act and its benefits. And just as far as saving dates, keep in mind that we continue to do caring conversations on a weekly basis. And our next one would be on Monday, August 29th. And our next BPNN webinar will be on Thursday, October 27th, same time, same place, and we hope that you will join us. And finally, we hope that you'll take the time to fill out, it's an online evaluation, but it always gives us input in terms of knowing how to improve on topics or build on anything that way. So please take the time to fill out that evaluation form. It's a 5-minute evaluation. So thank you all for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you again very soon. And enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye, everyone.